everyone, Matt here, and in this lesson we are going to cover Harry Gensler's objections to cultural relativism. So, first we need to be clear on exactly what cultural relativism is, and we can make a distinction between different kinds of truth. A relative truth is a truth that is relative to something or someone's frame of reference or perspective. For instance, the statement, "I am in California," is true because I am in California. But if someone else, say my dad or mom, were to state, "I am in California right now," then that would be false because they are not in California right now. So that statement, "I am in California," is true or false relative to the person's frame of reference or their perspective or where they happen to be located when they make that claim. Absolute truths are truths that are true no matter what a person's perspective or frame of reference is. So there are certain things that are true, like, for instance, the elements on the periodic table. What makes something a noble gas on the periodic table is an absolute truth. It doesn't matter what your frame of reference or your perspective is. The noble gases just happen to be the noble gases, and that's all there is to it. Or Newton's laws of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If that's true, then it's absolutely true. It doesn't matter what your frame of reference or your perspective is. But things like, "I love cookies," is relatively true. It's true when I say it, because I love cookies. But there's probably some psychopath out there who doesn't like cookies. And when they say, "I don't like cookies," then it's not true. No offense for those of you who do not like cookies. Okay, so that's the difference between a relative truth and an absolute truth. All right, here's another example. What color is the elk? Very simple answer. It looks brown to me. But now what color is it? Well, now it looks green. So what color is the elk? Well, it depends on your perspective. When you're looking at the elk in regular lighting conditions, and you're not colorblind, and you have normal vision, then the elk looks like it is brown. But when you look at the elk through night vision goggles, then the elk is going to look green. So the color of the elk depends on your perspective or your frame of reference. Or we could imagine looking at the elk through rose-colored glasses, and then the elk is going to look a different color. So the color that something is depends on your perspective, and so we could say that the color of something is a relative truth. If we were to turn the lights out and look at it, it would not look brown anymore. And so it's a relative truth. Well, what does this have to do with morality? Well, before we get to that question, we need to take a look at another way of using relativism to make sure that we're clear on exactly what we're talking about. I don't want there to be any misconceptions. So anthropologists and sociologists sometimes will adopt a viewpoint called methodological relativism. And according to methodological relativism, they are studying cultures and societies and people groups, and they want to make sure that their own biases don't cloud their judgment. And so what they do is they attempt to suspend their own bias in order to understand those cultures. We could say that this is a version of descriptive relativism. When you engage in methodological relativism or descriptive relativism, you are merely describing what people do or what they believe. You're not passing any kind of judgments on whether you think what they do is wrong or right, good or bad. Relativism in the field of ethics, on the other hand, we could think of that as a prescriptive viewpoint of relativism. And according to a prescriptive understanding of relativism, it's not just that you are trying to understand different ethical viewpoints, but you are actually making a claim about what's good and bad You're prescribing the way things ought to be based on a viewpoint of ethical relativism. So we could define relativism in several different ways. Gensler specifically argues against cultural relativism. According to cultural relativism, there is no objective truth about morality. And we've already seen views like this, like David Hume and J.L. Mackie. But according to cultural relativism, there are certain truths about morality that just happen to be relative truths. In the same way that the color of the elk was a relative truth depending on your perspective, any ethical claim or claim that X is good or X is morally right is going to be relative to a society. So if the majority of a society approves of something, then that makes that thing good, or morally right. So there are truths, they just happen to be relative truths. So things that are good and bad are not absolutely true, but they're only good and bad, morally good and bad, in a particular society. So there's no absolute truth. So things like kicking a puppy for the fun of it is morally wrong, that statement, it's not absolutely true. It depends on your perspective. It depends on whether or not the people in a society disapprove of kicking puppies for the fun of it. And in societies like ours, where we disapprove of that, then it's morally wrong. But you can imagine a society where kicking puppies for the fun of it is approved. And so in that society, it would be morally good to kick puppies for the fun of it. It's kind of hard to imagine, but according to cultural relativism, that's what it says. Okay, so what are Gensler's objections? All right, Gensler's first objection is that relativism cannot allow for consistent disagreement with the norms of one's own society. So this word norms we're using in this objection doesn't have to do with what's normal as much as it has to do with a standard of behavior. So if we've got some kind of standard of behavior in our society, if cultural relativism is true, then we cannot disagree with the standard of behavior in our society. And the argument goes something like this. The first two, number one and number two here, is just a restatement of cultural relativism. If something, X, is culturally approved, it automatically is good, according to cultural relativism. So if we disagree with X, then we're automatically wrong. So think about, for instance, in the last 10 years, there still is a disagreement about marriage. In the past, marriage between a man and a woman was culturally approved. Therefore, according to cultural relativism, then marriage between a man and a woman is good. And anybody who disagrees with that is automatically wrong. So as a result of cultural relativism, the marriage debate is settled. If relativism is true, then the people who argued for gay marriage were automatically wrong. And that makes a pretty simple argument. But most people in America today, at least, disagree with this way of thinking about it. And it's probably not the best way of arguing against gay marriage either, if you are against gay marriage. Okay, so that's objection number one. Objection number two is that relativism cannot account for the value of tolerance. This is a big objection because most people who argue for relativism want to be relativists because they think that it makes them more tolerant. We don't want to judge other people, and we want to be tolerant of other people. So people make the jump from tolerance to relativism. Unfortunately, according to Gensler, relativism cannot account for this value of tolerance. And here's a quick little argument for why that is the case. In some cultures, intolerance is socially approved. Therefore, according to relativism, intolerance is good in that culture. But relativists who want to be relativists because of tolerance are committed to tolerance. So it seems like relativists have to be committed to both tolerance and intolerance. And that seems like a contradiction. So if relativism is true, and some cultures approve of intolerance, then that means intolerance is good, which is exactly what most people who want to be relativists don't want. They want tolerance, and they adopt relativism because they think it leads to tolerance. But if relativism is true, then intolerance is good in some societies. So that's objection number 2. Objection number 3. Relativism implies that society's social norms are automatically right. This is a problem because if you think about in the past or even in the present in different cultures within the United States, there are different cultures within the United States. So think about Southern culture in the southeastern United States and the Civil Rights Movement. Back during the Civil Rights Movement, there were minority views that were rebelling against the societal norms of the southeastern United States, against the racism that was inherent in the system. And so they fought for equality. Well, if moral relativism, cultural relativism is true, then the Southern societal norms were automatically right, and all of the minority views were automatically wrong. So this seems like a big problem. If relativism is true, then that means Martin Luther King is wrong or was wrong, Rosa Parks was wrong, and anybody else who argued from the minority position against the societal norms of that time period. And this also seems like a big problem. All right, objection number 4. Relativism cannot tell us what to do when cultures overlap. Cultures are not clearly distinct. We are a part of multiple cultures at the same time. You could think of American culture as the culture of the United States. You can think of regional culture. Like I grew up in the southeastern United States, and so there's a culture in the southeast that's different from, say, the culture in the Pacific Northwest United States. So if you are an American, you're a part of American culture. You're also part of the regional culture in which you live, and you might also be part of a religious culture, or if you're an immigrant, you might be part of multiple. There's no limit to how many cultures that you can be a part of. So what are we supposed to do when these cultures overlap? What are we supposed to do if you are an immigrant from some other country and you move to the southeastern United States and you're part of Southern culture and you're part of American culture, you're still part of your native culture and part of a religious culture and a family culture? What are we supposed to do when there's disagreement, when those cultures overlap? Cultural relativism says that they're all right, and we have no way of knowing what to do when those cultures overlap. Here's an example. Suppose that you grew up in a culture where arranged marriages were the societal norm. According to cultural relativism, then arranged marriages are the right thing to do. And suppose that you move to the United States, where arranged marriages are very uncommon. So what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to follow the American culture of marrying who you want to marry? Or are you supposed to follow the culture from where you came from and have your family arrange the marriage? Well, cultural relativism doesn't tell you what to do when those cultures overlap. It also cannot give us any answers when there's moral problems between different societies. So if we are condemning some kind of behavior that another culture is engaged in, for instance, in some cultures, if someone is found to be homosexual, they will take them to the top of a tower and throw them off to their death. Well, if cultural relativism is true, then we cannot condemn that behavior. Or if slavery is still around as part of a culture, we cannot condemn that behavior either if their culture approves of it, because cultural relativism tells us that that other culture is automatically right. So we have no answer for resolving disagreements when it comes to moral judgments between societies. And that is objection number 4. So what is the alternative if moral relativism is bankrupt and has these devastating objections, as Gensler says. Well, Gensler wants to argue for a position called moral objectivism or moral realism. According to this view, there are certain things that are right or wrong, independent of the disapproval or approval of any society. And I've already given you an example of the kind of moral statement that moral objectivists appeal to in order to give an example. So just think of this example. Torturing a puppy for the fun of it is morally wrong. It doesn't seem like the wrongness of torturing puppies for the fun of it depends on anyone's approval or disapproval. It just seems like it's wrong. And it doesn't matter where you live or when you live, that is an example of something that just is wrong. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So many people reject moral realism. And Gensler goes through some of these objections and explains why he thinks these are not good objections to moral realism. So objection 1, morality is just a product of culture. So you might hear this as an objection. If morality is a product of culture, then there cannot be objective moral facts. Well, Gensler notes that just because morality is a product of culture doesn't mean that there are no moral facts, or there's no objective truth of the matter when it comes to morality. And he uses the example of books. Books are also a product of culture. But does that mean that there is no truth in books? No objective fact of the matter when it comes to the content of books? Of course not. So just because morality is a product of culture doesn't mean that moral realism is false. If you want to reject moral realism, you need more of an argument besides this. All right, objection number 2 to moral realism. Cultures disagree about morality. And this was the fundamental premise of one of Mackey's arguments. If there is some objective fact of the matter about morality, then we would expect cultures not to disagree so much. Well, Gensler points out mere disagreement about morality is not enough to show that there is no objective fact of the matter when it comes to morality. And here's an example. People disagree about how old the earth is. Does that mean there's no fact of the matter? You have some people that think that the earth is only 6,000 years old, and you have some people that think that the earth is billions of years old. So since they disagree, does that mean we should say, well, there's no objective fact of the matter? Well, of course not. There is an objective fact of the matter about the age of the earth. It's either somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And we might not know who's right or wrong on exactly the age of the earth. But there is a fact of the matter. And just because we disagree doesn't mean that there's no fact of the matter. So we need more if we want an argument against moral realism. All right, objection number 3. Some people say that they object moral realism because there's no clear way to resolve moral differences. And this seems like a problem, but it's not a problem that should lead us away from moral realism, according to Gensler. And he has an example that he thinks shows that this objection isn't good enough to undermine moral realism. So think about this. 10,000 years ago, if the people who think that the earth is 6,000 years old are wrong, 10,000 years ago, on this very spot where I'm sitting, it was either raining or it was not. It seems like there's a fact of the matter. But there's no clear way of telling whether or not it was raining on this spot at this moment 10,000 years ago. But since there's no clear way of resolving the dispute about whether or not it was raining, does that mean there's no objective fact of the matter about whether it was raining? Of course not. There is a fact. We just don't know what it is. And it might be the same way with moral differences. Just because there's no clear way to resolve moral differences doesn't mean that there's no fact of the matter. So he doesn't think objection 3 is a good objection to moral realism either. And there we have it. That is Harry Gensler's objections to moral realism. and his rebuttals to the arguments against moral realism.